Hello and welcome to the Synergen Leadership Podcast. My name's Julian, CEO and co-founder of Synergen Group, and once again really happy to bring you another episode of the podcast. So look, in today's show I speak with Scott Eblin, who is the author of The Next Level, What Insiders Know About Executive Success. And this was another really interesting interview for me because as I read through Scott's book, I thought there was a lot of really great practical tips. And it also gives you a nice framework in terms of how you can go about being more successful as an executive and how you can also really impact those around you. So I'm going to strongly recommend that you check out the book. Once again, it's called The Next Level, What Insiders Know About Executive Success. So happy listening and on with the show.
Welcome to the Synergen Leadership Podcast with Julian Carl. Julian speaks with leaders from around Australia to bring you their leadership story and share their insights about being a leader. To further help you build your leadership capability, Julian shares his own insights about leadership and the tools and techniques he uses as a leader.
Welcome, Scott, to the Synergen Leadership Podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time to be a part of it so that the listeners have a bit of an insight into Scott. Who is Scott Eblin?
That's a great question. Philosophical question maybe, but Scott Eblin, if I'm going to speak in the third person, Scott Eblin is an executive coach, a speaker, and an author, and a former corporate person who 18 years ago started the Eblin Group with his spouse, and our focus has evolved over the years, and it's best summarized in the idea that if you intend to lead at your best, you have to live at your best. And I've written a couple of books that are on both halves of that equation, both leading and living at your best. And this new edition of The Next Level, I think, captures everything that I think about, coach about, speak about, write about in one volume.
So why did you decide to write The Next Level?
Yeah, so that kind of goes back to the very beginning of being an executive coach. Like I said a moment ago, I started this 18 years ago, and I'd been a corporate manager and executive for about 15 years prior to the coaching business, and found myself at that point in my life, I was quite often the youngest whatever. I'm too old for that now, but back then it happened fairly regularly. And so as the youngest VP or the youngest executive member of the executive team or whatever it was. And I just found myself in over my head a lot, honestly, and like not knowing what to do. And especially as I hit the executive ranks, I found that the expectations were always high, but very rarely defined very clearly. And then I got into coaching, and I think, like attracts like. I started attracting individual coaching clients who were in situations in their companies that were similar to the ones that I'd been in mine in my corporate career. And I was encouraged by a coach named Marshall Goldsmith, who probably a lot of your listeners have heard of. He's pretty well known and is a very successful author. And Marshall knows a lot of people, and I was with a group of coaches with him back in 2004, and he encouraged all of us to think about the book that we wanted to write. And so I started thinking about that, and there's an old thing about write what you know, and what I knew was what it was like to be in over your head and trying to figure out what the expectations are of executives and how to operate at the next level. And so that, back in the early months of 2004 was the initial seeds of the idea, and over the next couple of years ended up writing the book in its first edition that came out in the spring of 2006.
Okay, and the upcoming edition is the third edition, I believe.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about that. I never thought I'd have an opportunity to write even a book, at one point in my life, and to have the third edition of my first book coming out is exciting for me. And I'm like I said, I'm really happy to have the opportunity to put what I've learned over the years, in working with different clients and working with companies all over the world. Just from that experience, you learn so much from that experience of working with clients, and be able to codify that and summarize all that in this third edition is, I feel really grateful for that.
Okay. So I want to start with this the next level model of executive presence, which is sort of the framework for the book, and that's sort of broken down into personal presence, team presence, and organizational presence. I'm going to explore that in more detail, but are you able to give the listeners just a bit of a high level overview of that and how you came to that model?
Sure. And this goes back to the early days in 2004, thinking through the book, and I've kind of enhanced it a little bit in this third edition. You mentioned leadership presence. And so when I talked a minute ago about executive presence, or the expectations of executives being always high, but usually not really clearly defined, what I was trying to do with that table was summarize in a nutshell, basically, what are the expectations in those three categories: personal, team, and organizational presence. And how do you show up as a leader in each of those three domains: personal, team, and organizational? So that's kind of if I was describing the table, the left-hand side of the table are those three buckets: personal, team, and organizational. And the two columns next to that are picking up and letting go. What behaviors do you need to pick up, and what behaviors do you need to let go of as you're making these transitions into next level roles or even next level situations in your career? And so there are 9 sets of behaviors that one needs to pick up or let go of that are represented in that table. We can probably talk more about that as we go. The additional insight that I've had over the years that I've talked about in the third edition in relation to the basic model is, I think, for those 3 buckets: personal, team, and organizational, you can translate those really into 3 key leadership imperatives. And so for the personal space, I think it's about managing yourself. That's really what that part of the book is all about, is managing yourself. And then the team is really about leveraging your team to get bigger things done, and to work through and with your team to get bigger things done. And then the organizational piece is really about engaging your colleagues, because that's where a lot of the additional value is created, is through that collaboration that comes when you really effectively engage with your colleagues. So manage yourself, leverage your team, engage your colleagues. And I think about it now as almost like a pyramid, where manage yourself is at the foundation of the pyramid, because if you're not doing that effectively, then you're not going to really be very effective in leveraging your team. You're going to make a lot of wrong decisions. Your relationships won't be as strong as they could be with your team, and you're going to overlook some things and go too deep on other things, and it just doesn't work. And so if you're not leveraging your team effectively, then you don't usually have the bandwidth to engage your colleagues effectively. And again, you end up leaving value on the table if you're not doing that. So manage yourself, leverage your team, engage your colleagues. I think it really all starts with managing yourself.
So I'm interested in exploring quite a number of the 9 behaviours that you mentioned, and probably the first one is this idea of picking up confidence in your presence and letting go of doubt in how you contribute. Are you able to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of the starting point. There's one of the opening lines I have in the chapter on that pick up and let go distinction is, insecure people make lousy leaders. And I think if your listeners were to think back about the best boss they've ever had, and I would encourage them right now, actually think of a specific person who's the best boss you've ever had, and think about for a moment about why were they? What were the characteristics that made them your best boss? And then conversely, who's the worst boss you ever had? And I've learned from talking with people that usually comes a lot more quickly. The worst boss. And the reasons why they're the worst boss usually come much more quickly. If it's a group of people, I can't keep up with the answers quite often when they start talking about why their worst boss was the worst boss. But it really comes down to the distinction between the best and the worst is the best bosses have a quiet confidence in themselves. I was just talking with an association, trade association president earlier this afternoon about his feedback on one of my clients who's on his national board here in the U.S. And he was talking about my client, and he was talking about some of the best CEOs that he's ever worked with. They have a quiet confidence. It's not cockiness, but they believe in themselves. They believe in their point of view. They give others space to talk, and they listen when they talk. But it's this grounded confidence. Then if you think about the worst boss you've ever had, they micromanaged, or they withheld information, or they went on rages or whatever. And if you boil it down about all those negative behaviors that the worst bosses exhibit, why is that? Well, at the root of it, they're insecure. They're insecure people. And so, you pick up confidence, you let go of doubt. When you move into these bigger jobs, they're really scary sometimes, and they're really intimidating sometimes. And you're working with really talented people, and you get this little voice inside your head that says, "Oh my gosh, I really shouldn't be here. There's a huge mistake when they promoted me into this thing. If they only knew what I don't know," and blah 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 blah. And I refer to that little voice as the itty bitty shitty committee. It's just like it makes you do weird things, and you've got to recognize that little inner voice that is getting in the way, and understand how you really are when you're at your best, and lean into that. And if you do that, then you're going to show up with more confidence.
So there's an excerpt I'd like to read, which is very much talking about results and relationships. To achieve and sustain results over the long run at the executive level, strong relationships with peers, top leadership, and functional team members across the organisation are critical. Your success in managing relationships will stem from the confidence you have in yourself and your ability to work well with others to make things happen. Effective relationship management comes from regularly demonstrating the behaviours that you engage in when you're leading and living at your best.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you think results and relationships are so closely tied together?
Well, I quite often I think of it like an XY graph, where on the vertical axis, it doesn't matter which one you have on the vertical axis, but let's just say that results-oriented behaviors are on the vertical axis and relational-oriented behaviors are on the horizontal. The best leaders work in the upper right-hand corner of that graph. You can get results in the short run. Perhaps you can get results in the short run by micromanaging and pushing your agenda far ahead of everybody else's agenda and so forth. But in the longer run, that doesn't work, because in the longer run, you're working with the same people month in and month out, year in and year out quite often. And people are people. They like to work with people that they like. They like to work with people who aren't assholes. And if you show up like a jerk, then eventually people are going to disconnect from you. So, those relational behaviors are really, really key to long-term success. From a utilitarian standpoint, that's important. I think from a humanistic standpoint, there are other reasons why that's important. People with strong relationships, it's proven through many studies, live longer and are healthier than people who don't have strong relationships in their life. And then the results, I used to have a phrase that I would sometimes use, NGB, which was an acronym for he's a nice guy, but, you want to be a nice guy or a nice gal, but you still have to get stuff done, and you still have to focus on managing yourself, leveraging your team, to achieve things. And, there's the follow-through behaviors, and there's the metric-oriented behaviors, and all kinds of things that are really much more focused on specific results and achieving those results. And so it's a marriage, really, of the two categories. And I think the most effective leaders are great at both.
So I'd like to explore this idea that you talk about in terms of picking up your regular renewal of your energy and perspective and letting go of running flat out to your crash, because I'm finding that a lot of leaders that I speak to, the expectations are getting more, the resources they're being provided with are less, and people are really starting to recognize this need to look after themselves.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I see it all the time in my work. I do a lot of public speaking in my work, whether it's keynotes or workshops. I'll be doing a keynote on Monday for a bunch of people. And the first thing I'm going to ask, just to get a sense of the room, is it a raise your hand kind of question. And I do this a lot with groups. Raise your hand if in the last year you've been promoted or taken a new assignment. And so a lot of hands will go up. Second question is raise your hand within the last year. You're in the same job you were in a year ago, but the scope is a lot bigger today. Almost every hand in the room goes up on that question with any corporate audience. It's always over 80%, and it's usually close to 95 or 100%. And so to me, that's like a leading indicator of what you just said, Julian, which is people are expected, I think, in this day and age to do more with less. And if you're in the same job you're in a year ago, but the scope is bigger today than it was a year ago, that's just proving the point, right? You're doing more with less, or doing more at least with the same amount, right? And I don't know about you, but I think it's gotten progressively worse, if you want to use that term, year over year, really, over the last 10 years or so. I think it started with the financial crisis in 2008. Organizations very quickly had to put the brakes on and figure out how to do more with less just to survive at that period. But I think they've become really, really excellent at it. And even as the economy has recovered in most parts of the world, you still see that. And I think the other thing that happened about 11 years ago was Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone, and everybody's carrying a smartphone around in their pocket that has more computing power than the supercomputer NASA used to land men on the moon. Just that one smartphone that you have has more processing power than a mainframe computer that filled up a building, back in the space age era. And so that enables you to work all the time if you want to. You can pretty much do anything on your phone that you can do at your desk. And I've seen research out of the Center for Creative Leadership that the average smartphone-enabled executive or manager is spending, it's an average of 72 hours a week out of a 168-hour week, 72 hours a week connected to their work. So it adds up. And I think it ends up leaving people in a chronic, all those conditions leave a lot of executives in a chronic state of fight or flight, where their sympathetic nervous system is on overdrive, and all the systems in their body that either elevate or de-elevate when they're in physical danger, and their fight or flight response kicks in to protect them. That same chronic fight or flight response, where it's that low-grade sense of threat from all the stuff that you're not getting done and all the stuff that remains to be done, it has a huge impact on your short-term effectiveness as a leader and an executive. It has a more significantly parable impact on your health and well-being and your life expectancy. So it's super important to have routines of renewal for both short-term and long-term reasons.
Yeah. In the book, you talk about this life GPS approach that you've developed, and the sort of the three big questions that go along with that. I'd like to explore those three big questions. So can you share with the listeners what those three big questions are?
Sure. I kind of put it in the context of the Life GPS, which is the Life GPS is a one-pager. Basically, it's a worksheet where we're asking these three questions you're referring to, and encouraging our clients and my readers and your listeners. I'd be happy to provide you a PDF of it if you want to share it with the podcast. But we're encouraging them to ask and answer for themselves three questions on this one pager. And so the first big question is, how are you at your best? How do you know yourself to be when you're really at your best? And not just in your life at work, but in your life outside of work, your life at home, your life in your community. If you think about peak performance kinds of experiences that you've had in any of those three arenas, what are the common denominators, that describe you when you're really operating at your best, kind of at the peak? The second big question is, what are the routines that you either have in your life or you need to incorporate into your life to make it more likely that you would lead and live at your best? And those routines come in four domains: physical, mental, relational, and spiritual. And I'm trying to encourage people to identify their short list, the short list that has a lot of leverage in each of those routines. And we can talk more about, criteria for selecting those routines if you like. And then the third big question of the Life GPS is, if we're consistently living and leading at your best, what outcomes would you hope or expect to see in those three big arenas of life: your life at home, your life at work, and your life in the community? One of my favorite quotes is from Gandhi, and he said, "In regard to every action, one must know the result that is expected to follow, otherwise known as cause and effect." If I'm showing up at my best consistently, what outcomes would I expect to see? And it doesn't have to be specific to the letter. And, you don't want to get wedded to it because there's things that we don't control. But notionally, what kinds of outcomes would I expect to see? It's cause and effect, or in Gandhi's tradition, karma, right? And then so having all those answers on one page becomes just like Google Maps or Waze or Apple Maps or whatever you use on your device. You enter the latitude and the longitude, and you enter the address in, and there's a latitude and a longitude associated with that. And through the magic of GPS technology, those satellites orbiting the Earth, iterate back and forth with your phone and the app to make adjustments in your route to help you arrive where you need to arrive. And entering those answers is a kind of a reference point. Like you pull it out once a week and ask yourself, how am I doing? How am I doing on showing up at my best? How am I doing on the routines that help me do that? How am I doing on outcomes? And we can always improve, like what adjustment do I want to make this week? It doesn't have to be 10 adjustments, just pick one, and be intentional about working it.
Yeah, because I think it would be very powerful, because I think one of the most powerful things that a leader can do is take the time to reflect on themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And this sounds as though it would be a very good way for people to reflect, provide them with a little bit of structure and allow them to think deeply about these things.
Yeah, I completely agree with the structure point you just made. It's a simple routine, right? But, another one of my favorite quotes, which I'm sure you heard, is it's attributed to Aristotle. I think it's a summation of some different things that he wrote. But, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. So what are the habits or routines that you need in your life to show up at the most excellent version of yourself, you at your best? And I find, in corporate life, most executives and managers even, they annually or, on some sort of regular basis, they'll spend some time with their colleagues doing a strategic planning session, planning for the future and what they want to accomplish and how they're going to get there and all that. And so we do that in an organizational life pretty frequently, but I find a lot of people don't do that at all for themselves, and I think there's every reason that we should. And my wife and I, we came up with the GPS, life GPS for ourselves, 20 some plus years ago now, when we were parents of young kids and life was at its craziest. And we were big fans of the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey. And I still love that book. I think it's great, but I always found it difficult to operationalize what Covey was talking about in that book. And so we just spent several weekends thinking like, okay, if we just had a one pager, we were calling it Covey for Dummies, basically. If we had a one pager that, would be useful to us, what would it incorporate? And that's what we ended up with. So we've used it ourselves for 22 or 3 years now, and have we have it coming up at the end of next month as we speak, and at the end of November, we'll take a weekend long retreat together, and we have a lot of fun. We're going to go to wine country on the retreat this year, and we'll drink a lot of wine, but we'll spend a fair amount of time that weekend talking about our life GPS and how we did this year and what we'd like to be different this coming year, and are there any adjustments we need to make in our routines or the way we think about ourselves or any of that. And it's just like super useful to get up on the balcony from time to time and take the bigger picture look and figure out how you want to operate when you're back down there on the dance floor.
Yeah, because I think it's important because it covers both the personal, professional, because I think you mentioned earlier about the issue with smartphones. I think the personal, professional boundaries have almost disappeared for many leaders now.
That's really true. I mean, the boundaries word, I think, is super important. One of my favorite things to ask a group, is 2 questions about boundaries. Question number 1 is, do you have any? Because I think a lot of people, they used to have them, but they've kind of let them go, and they don't even realize it. And then the second question, okay, is if you have any boundaries, does anybody else know what they are? Because if they don't, and you don't enforce your boundaries, you may as well not have them. And it's pretty basic stuff, but it's super important for people to get a grip on.
One of the things that comes up for us in the leadership programs we run is quite often the leaders in the room are looking for ideas and suggestions and techniques for being better communicators. And you've got this model, pick up custom fit communications and let go of one size fits all communications. Are you able to expand a bit more on that?
Sure. I mean, there's a cliche we have in the States. I don't know if you guys use it in Australia. If you're good with a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think sometimes our communications can kind of fall into that trap. We have a preferred way or style of communicating, and that may be effective, probably not effective in all cases. And so custom fit communications is outcome oriented and audience specific. What am I trying to do in this communications exchange, or whether it's a presentation or a conversation or a team meeting or whatever it might be, and who am I communicating with? And so there are three questions that I learned many years ago from I think to me is one of the leading thinkers in the field of human resources, a guy named Dave Ulrich, who has been associated with the University of Michigan for many years. And Dave taught me that any communications piece or exchange can be improved by considering three questions: what, so what, and now what. What are we talking about? So what? What is, why does this person or why should this group care? What do they care about? I mean, can I shape my communications to answer the question, so what, for them? Because if I can't do that, then I better keep working on it until I can. And then now what? What do I want this person or this group to know or think or do or feel or believe next? What's the next step? What's the now what? And, that, especially in a business setting or an organizational setting, I think those three questions are super important because, it's usually about getting outcomes, and it's usually about identifying next steps or solving the next part of the problem. And, but to solve the problem or to get to the next step, people have to be motivated to take the next step. So the so what's really important, and you got to be really clear about what are we talking about,
Yeah, it's a great little model. I like that one. So you talk about this idea of mastering wholesale communication.
Mm-hmm.
When you say that, how do you mean?
Well, so the comparison point is retail, right? There's retail and there's wholesale. And I think when you're coming up as a leader, most of your communications are what I would call retail communications, meaning that it's one-to-one or one to a few. And, by its nature is pretty high touch quite often. I think the further you go as a leader, and I think this has changed some over the years. Certainly it's changed over the years with the emergence of social media, because I think it's probably less true than it used to be. But as you take on larger roles as a leader, your communication style really has to account for a broader audience. So it's more of a wholesale approach, right? And there are different considerations in terms of how you custom fit the communications to reach a broader audience. But there are certainly opportunities in terms of the modalities, that you use to reach a broader audience. And again, when I first wrote The Next Level in 2006, there was no such thing as Twitter. There was no such thing as Facebook. There was no such thing as Instagram, or I don't think there was even LinkedIn back then. And, now obviously in 2018, all of that's there. So it's a lot easier for one person to reach a wholesale audience than it used to be. But as you're doing that, I think you need to be, and I think we see a lot of people not doing this in social, and their social media and the way they wholesale their communications. You really got to consider the what, so what, now what again, and not just put noise into the system for the sake of putting noise into the system, but really consider, what am I trying to do here? What do I want people to know? Why should they care? Is there anything I want them to do? What's the call to action? And really work through that as you whatever channels you're using, however broad an audience you're trying to reach. I think those questions are really important things to think through.
Mm. You also, in the team presence part of your model, you talk about this idea of picking up team reliance and letting go of self-reliance. Mm-hmm. So do you find that's a hard one for leaders to follow through on?
Do you? In your experience?
Oh, absolutely. That's why I wanted to explore it.
Yeah, I think it's the hardest, maybe, because most people who end up in leadership positions that I've observed over the years, the large majority of them, over 80% for sure, got there because they're go-to people. Do you guys use that phrase in Australia?
Yeah.
Go-to person? Yeah. Okay. So, so any group I talk to, of accomplished, high potential senior leaders, whether they're high potential or senior, but they're in the room, they've been selected for this program because they're good. And so I'll ask for a show of hands. How many of you either think of yourself or have thought of yourself or have had people tell you that you're a go-to person? And most of them, if they're honest, they raise their hands. And the very next question is, so good, what do go-to people do that makes them go-to people? What do you think their number one answer is?
They get stuff done.
Exactly. Number one answer. Yeah, they get stuff done. Okay, so being a go-to person, great thing to be until it's no longer a great thing to be. And when is that? And it's when the scope gets to be so big you can't operate as the hero or the heroine anymore. And you've got to let it go. You've got to let go of that self-reliance and pick up team reliance. And so there's a shift that I think every go-to person has to make if they're going to scale their leadership, and really have the broader impact that they have to be successful. They've got to make the shift from being the go-to person to that leader who builds and nurtures teams of go-to people. That's the job now, is for you not to be the go-to person anymore, but to, coach people up so that they're the go-to people. You've got a whole team full of them. And if you get that right, everything else is way better.
And I imagine that would link very much to one of the other points you talk about in the book, which is pick up defining what to do and let go of telling how to do it.
Right, it totally does, because it's interesting that one of the people I quote in the book, I didn't have the opportunity to interview him directly, but a friend of mine who worked with him at the time told me this. Bob Pittman is an American businessman who's been in a lot of different industries and a long track record of success. And back when America Online, if anybody remembers that, or AOL, if they even remember AOL at this point, but it used to be AOL, America Online, they helped kind of create the internet as we know it. I mean, instant messaging and, email and, you've got mail and all of that, came out of AOL. So they used to be huge. And Pittman was the executive vice president, I think, at AOL back then, as number 2 person there, chief operating officer, I guess. And he used to start every senior leadership team meeting, I'm told, by reminding everybody else in the room, say, remember, folks, we're the keepers of the what, not the masters of the how. Like our job is to really define what we're going to do here. And we've got plenty of people who are probably smarter than we are, who are experts in the how, and their version of how is probably going to be better than ours. And it's really hard, just like it's hard to let go of self-reliance. I think it's really hard for go-to people to let go of their version of how. And what they often find when they finally get to the point where they do is their team did it better, or can do it better. And by doing it better, that frees that leader up to do the stuff that only they can do in the leadership role that they're in. Because there are always resources and opportunities and access and all kinds of other intangible assets that accrue to you when you're in a designated leadership role in an organization. And because right now you're the incumbent, you're the person sitting in that leadership seat, there's certain things that only you can do. And that's a short list usually, but a very high impact, high leverage list. And there's a bunch of stuff you could do. There's a bunch of stuff you might like to do. You need to let go of that stuff, because this list of stuff that only you can do is where the leverage is, and you've got to let go of the how and focus a lot more on the what to make that shift.
I think you also talk in the book about this idea of getting the right people in the right roles. Mm-hmm. And I imagine that would be crucial to being able to let go of the how, is by having those right people in those right roles.
Sure. Otherwise you kind of go into the death spiral, right? It's, Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, is famous for many, many great one-liners, but one of his best was, get the right people in the right seats on the bus.
Yeah.
And, very easy to write or say, very hard to do in practice. I think it's a continuous process of and sort of constantly assessing, are these the right people, and they may be the right people for where we are now. Are they going to be the right people to get where we need to go? Maybe, maybe not. Some of them are, some of them aren't. Okay, now we've gotten to the next place, and we have aspirations that go beyond this. What are we going to need for this next go round? I think that's one of the key jobs of a leader is, you're sort of the chief talent management officer for your team. Yeah, sure, there's HR, but you're the one that's putting the team together. You're the one that's leading the team and setting the agenda and setting the goals and coaching people to reach the goals and all that kind of stuff. And, if you don't have good people and talented people and motivated people, a lot of that's on you, to motivate them. But it doesn't work.
Yeah, and as you said before, it's a lot easier said and written on a piece of paper than done, isn't it?
Oh my goodness, yeah. I think the reason is because you're never done. You're never done with that. I don't know if we'll talk about delegation today, but I find a lot of managers kind of have a failure point with delegation. They say, well, I delegated and they didn't do it right. And so now I've got to take it back. Did you see that?
Yes.
It's like, like delegation is not like set it and forget it on your washing machine. I mean, it requires different levels of check-in and were you clear about what success looks like and what are the success measures and, blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's so many things to think about and be clear about when you're delegating it. And once you delegate it, you probably still have to check in and there's a lot of different things to pay attention to. So I think it's sort of the same thing with, right people in the right roles. It's, you can't take your eye off that ball. You constantly have to pay attention to it.
Mm. And I think one of the crucial things about getting those right people in the right roles is something that you talk about, where you talk about the importance of expectations when they're clear and when they're not clear. And my experience tells me that's one of the biggest challenges leaders are facing in terms of setting expectations for their own team, but also having expectations set for them.
Yeah. You mean like upward? You mean like kind of the managing up part of it?
Yeah, both ways actually. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's there's a model that I reference in the book. I first saw it at GE and some of the work that came out of GE years ago, but I'm told it was developed prior to GE. I don't remember the name of the fellow who developed it, but it's GRPI, and it's kind of a diagnostic. And what GRPI means are goals. What are the goals for the organization or for the team? The R is roles and responsibilities. Are we clear what everybody's roles and responsibilities are? The P stands for plans and processes. Like what are the plans that are going to get us to the goals? What processes are we going to use to make sure that we're on track with the plan and to stay in touch and communicate with each other and measure it along the way and the milestones and everything else that goes with that. And then the I is for interpersonal norms. What are our ground rules for operating with each other? Well, any one of those four things, GRPI, is all about expectations, and it's all about making it clear. And, one of the things I've concluded over the years in working with lots of different people is quite often you'll see a lack of preparation. We just kind of dive into things without giving a thought really to what are we trying to do here and what has to be in place for that to happen? How do we need to show up as leaders to do this, or how do we need to operate as a team to do this? And I love these little diagnostics, like the Grippy model. I've got one that's in the new edition of the book that I developed for Delegation called Track. What's the task? What's the clear request around the task? What the A is, what does achievement look like if we're wildly successful? What's full-on achievement look like? C stands for check-ins. What's the process for that? And K is knowledge that we hope to gain from this, and kudos. What kind of recognition might there be, and rewards might there be if this all goes well? And I've got a more detailed diagnostic or planning sheet around those 5 things. And I find, 5 minutes of thinking through something like that, or an hour of talking with your team about the goals and the roles and the processes and the interpersonal norms, it's incredibly good ROI on that stuff. But a lot of people don't go there. So, I think it's worth the investment of time. One of the things that I learned in my corporate career, and this is sort of the punchline to a long story that I won't tell, but the punchline in this group conversation was, what doesn't get said doesn't get heard. And I think sometimes we just think, well, I don't need to say that. That's obvious. Well, obvious to you, maybe not obvious to everybody else. Check it. Say it. And they say, really? Is that it? Okay, now we can have a good conversation to make sure we're all clear.
One of the models that we introduced to our clients, and I actually did it with a brand new client last week, is the GROW model, which is for coaching, and you've referenced it in here. I'm curious to know how you use it and what have been some of the outcomes that you've been able to achieve, or your clients have been able to achieve through using that model.
Yeah. So let's give credit to the late, great John Whitmore, who I credit with developing that model. He wrote a great book years ago called Coaching for Performance, and I think he passed away a couple of years ago. I read his obituaries. He had an amazing life. He was a Formula One, amateur Formula One driver, in addition to being a coach, which is very cool. But Whitmore developed the GROW model, I think, and so that's another acronym, and it stands for what's the goal? Again, what are we trying to do? Sort of the same as Grippy. What's the goal? The R stands for reality. Where are we now? What's the current state? The O stands for options. What can we do to change the current state of reality and make things better? And the W, I've seen it described different ways, but I usually say it stands for what's next. What are the next one or two steps? Not the next 100, but the next one or two. And so what I've added to Whitmore's framework are a set of questions for each of those four big headers: goals, reality, options, and what's next. And one thing I love to do is I have my clients and folks in my workshop audiences, when we're doing a workshop, I have them think of a real life problem or a real life opportunity that they either need to solve or take advantage of, but they haven't figured it out yet how to do it, and pair them up for 8 minutes. Okay, you're going to coach person A is going to coach person B. Here's your script. And it's a series of sequence questions, most of which start with the word what, because I think most good coaching questions start with the word what. And about any question you can think of can be reframed as a what question. And we can talk more about that if you want. But and then just walking it through. And one of the big pivot points in the sequence of the questions that I want them to ask is at the end of the reality box on the grid. The last question is, so what have you tried so far? Okay, this is your reality. And what have you tried so far to fix that? And so the person answers. And then the very first question in the options part of the script is, what else could you try? And I always say when we're introducing it, by that question, what else could you try? Right, times 3. So we're in the coaching conversation. So Julian, what have you tried so far? You're going to say, well, I've tried this. Okay, great. What else could you try? I don't know. I could try that. Perfect. What else could you try? Oh gosh, I don't know. I could try this other thing. Great. What else could you try? Well, Scott, you're annoying the hell out of me now. Yeah, I don't care. What else could you try? And okay, well, I guess I could try this other thing. Okay. And so what always happens is usually as they go through it and they identify, okay, which one of these things are you really going to follow through on? What are the next steps? Quite often, they're going to decide that the second or third idea they had on what else could you try is the one that's really worth pursuing. And just by the persistence of saying, okay, what else? What else? What else? You get people out of their thought patterns. They just like round up the usual suspects almost. It's like, I'm going to do what I've always done. Well, really? You're going to get what you always got. So like, what else could you try? And I find that really, really kind of the pivot point of the conversations for people quite often.
It's a very well received coaching model over here. A lot of organizations use it and really try to get their leaders to start thinking of themselves a bit more as coaches.
Yeah, I think completely. I mean, Whitmore was a Brit, out of the UK, and that book, Coaching for Performance, we actually share the same publisher. Is the publisher of that book is a publisher of The Next Level, and I think it's their number one bestseller, or number two at least, and has been for years. Is the Coaching for Performance book global? It's a global bestseller.
Yeah. So you also talk about this idea of building next level capacity.
Uh-huh.
I'm curious to explore that a little bit with you.
Yeah. I'm curious what resonated with you about that point.
Look, it's one of those things, I think, where I think a lot of the stuff which gets in people's way is a little voice that you mentioned earlier before. And I see my role as a facilitator when I'm in front of the room is to help them sort of push that little voice to the side and highlight the fact that, if they want to achieve something, they can. And I think it's quite often about what's their capability, what's their capacity for being the best they can be. And so when I read it here, I thought, I want to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I said a minute ago that I think the best coaching questions start with what. And I learned that years ago from a coach here in the States named Laura Berman Fortgang. I was in a workshop that she was leading, and she made that point and really believes it, because her point was, what questions are like the Google of questions. It's like typing in a question to the search field on Google. You get a lot of stuff back, right? And so what opens up a range of possibilities, and I could ask, I could ask you, why did you do that? And if I ask you that question, what's your reaction to why did you do that? Like emotionally, what's your reaction?
That you're questioning my decision, that you're not quite sure about why I did it, and
you're gonna feel a little defensive, or maybe like this person doesn't think I'm smart enough or whatever, right?
Yeah.
But I could reframe that question as, Julian, what was your thought process on that? Right? Yeah. And it feels a little bit different somehow, because now I'm talking about this thing called my thought process. I still learn why you did it, but I'm just like I'm just making it easier for you to answer it and think through it and not feel so defensive. And I think it's, and I'm not sure this exactly answers your question where you wanted to go, but one of the things that I've noticed over the years in working with leaders is the emotional component quite often gets overlooked when they're thinking through how they interact with their team or their colleagues or whatever. It's there's logic, and then there's emotion, and maybe long on logic and short on emotional consideration. And the way you frame questions, the way you coach, the way you interact is either going to open people up or shut them down. And maybe it's not that binary, but I think those are two ends of the spectrum. And I don't know. I just think it's worth considering. Like one of my favorite questions, like two of my favorite questions. Like if I could only ask two questions as a coach, they would be: so what are you trying to do? Like in this next thing, like what are you trying to do? What success look like? And then the second question is, how do you need to show up to make that likely? And that's where the value is. Most people are pretty clear on what they're trying to get done. A lot of the time they are. But I find they give very short shrift to how they need to show up, with their energy level, with their tone of voice, with their body language, just all of those, sometimes called intangible. I don't think they really are intangible components of the overall experience, and what do I want this person to think? How do they need, there's a coach named Alexander Kaye, who's a friend and colleague of mine, and he's famous for what he calls the thinking path, which you can think about it from left to right. Let's start in the right-hand side. It ends with results. Okay, so what is it that creates results? Actions create results. And where do actions come from? Well, they usually come from thoughts. So you've got thoughts and actions and results kind of in that order. But what gets missed is in between the thought and the action is a feeling, and so the thought always generates an emotional response. So you have to ask yourself, not just what do I want these people to think, or how do I need them to think to get to the action that leads to the result. I also need to think through, how do they feel, or how do they, what kind of feeling and emotional state is going to lead to the action that gets the best result. And so do I want them to feel excited and well supported and all the things that lead to positive actions and positive results? Or do they feel discouraged and disenfranchised and put upon and not valued or whatever? You got to think through that stuff and adjust your actions adjust your approach accordingly, because negative emotions rarely lead to great actions and great results.
Yeah, and you actually talk about this idea of picking up accountability for many results and letting go of responsibility for few results. So they're very obviously tied together.
Yeah, they are. And I think the shorthand way to talk about that, and this is kind of the last part of the team presence part of the book, is if you're responsible, you do it. If you're accountable, you own it. And I think too many leaders and managers and executives are stuck in doing it. And the analogy I use, here in the States, a lot of people live in the suburbs and they have grass-covered yards, and they have a lawnmower and they can cut their own grass. And a lot of people I talk to, they like to cut their own grass, because it gives me 45 minutes or an hour to not really think about anything other than doing the yard work, and nobody trims the edges the way I do, and the lines are perfect and all this, whatever it is that they enjoy about that. So great, you can be personally responsible for cutting your own grass, and you can do that. Let's think though, like if you owned a yard care service that cut 1,000 yards a week, there's no way you can be personally responsible for all that. You're accountable for it. You own the results, but you don't do it, the results. You've got crews that are out there cutting all those yards for you and taking care of all those lawns and yards. And they're doing it, but you got to own it, right? And be accountable for it. And so there are different systems and processes that you've got to put in place to be accountable in an effective way. The measurement systems and the reporting systems and the routines and the cycles you go through just to stay on top of everything and make sure everybody's got what they need to do the work, and that they're doing good work, and that the customers are happy, and all of that. So that's the distinction.
I really like that grass analogy.
Do you have a yard with grass?
I used to. I don't now, but I think that's a really clever way of explaining it, so in a way that makes sense to people. So I'd like to explore this idea of looking left, right, and diagonally as you lead. I was intrigued by that.
Yeah, so that's the first pick up and let go distinction in the organizational presence or engaging your colleagues part of the book. And I think, you've got to look up and down. You've got to look up to your boss and down to your team. If you think about the traditional organizational model, I mean, you're leading the team. They need your time and attention. You work for your boss, on the upward axis and part of the axis, and you need to do an effective job of keeping your boss in the loop and making sure that your agendas align and all of that. So the up and down are really vitally important, but I think a lot of people stop there. And it's what I call vertical tunnel vision. I mean, they just kind of like get focused on the up and down. It's like, all they see is the vertical. And there's a lot of research. I think I always refer to a gentleman named Rob Cross, who is now at Davidson College in the U.S. But for years, Rob was at the University of Virginia at the Darden School there, the business school, and actually McIntyre School of Commerce. I think it was the undergrad school. But Rob started an organization years ago called the Network Roundtable, and he's still doing that. It's called the Collaborative Commons, I think now. But he got into that whole field of study based on a research study that he did years ago, decades ago now, where he and his colleagues studied 200, the top 20% of performers in 200 different organizations. So he used the performance management system to identify who are the top 20% of the people in this company. And then they interviewed those people to try to figure out, what are you doing that the other 80% aren't doing so well? And the number one answer was they managed their networks better than everybody else. And so they didn't just manage up and down, they managed left and right. Who are my colleagues on either side of me at the peer level that I need to collaborate with and engage your colleagues and to collaborate with to get bigger results, 1 + 1 = 3 kind of results. And then what really set them apart was they didn't just go left and right, they worked the diagonals. They didn't really care what the hierarchy was, or who had more status or less status, or who was in bounds or out of bounds. They just went after people who could help them accomplish their agendas and tried to establish good, sound working relationships with those people. So it ends up being sort of a 360-degree approach to networking. There's not just up and down, there's not just left and right, but there's diagonals up and down and, leftish and rightish, right? And so that's kind of what I mean by left, right, and diagonally is, that vision in mind of somebody who's really clear about what they're trying to accomplish and is not limiting their resources to themselves and their team, or whoever's immediately visible. They're really searching for who are the people I need to work with, who are the best possible people to accomplish the results that we need to accomplish.
In talking about networking, you actually give in the book 5 steps to building the network. Are you able to run through those? Because I find that the networking is one of the most unfocused things that happens in leaders that I work with, that they don't necessarily view networking as a core part of what they do. They tend to be focused on results and getting the job done. So I'm always promoting the value of building a strong network. So what are the 5 steps?
Yeah. So I give a little preamble to the 5 steps. I completely agree with what you just said. I see it too. And one of the questions I'll usually ask of a group, how many of you believe that it's really actually important to do a good job of managing your network, that it's a strategic advantage to manage your network well? And usually like 90 to 100% of the people are going to say, yeah, it's really important. And the next question is, how many of you think you're doing a great job with that? And usually you see 5 to 10% of the people say, yeah, I think I'm doing a great job. So like 90% or more think it's important, but aren't really doing a very good job with it. Okay, so the next question, why is that? Like, why aren't you managing your network if you all think it's important? I guess I'll ask you again, what do you think their number one answer is?
Not my job. That's for salespeople. That's often the one I get.
Yeah, that's interesting. The one I hear the most is time. Like, I'd like to, I just don't have time, right? And there's this cartoon from the New Yorker magazine that is a classic cartoon from there that I'll show on the screen sometimes. It's this guy at his desk looking at his calendar, on his desk, his planner laid out on his desk. He's on the phone. And the caption of the picture of this guy on the phone looking at his calendar is, no, Thursday's out. How about never? Is never good for you? And it's, I think people love that because it's like, oh yeah, like I don't have time for one more networking event or one more coffee or one more lunch, so like I got too much to do. And so what I'm trying to get them to focus on is here, you don't have to worry about another networking event. Like, what are you working on that requires expertise or innovative thinking or collaboration that you and your team can't get on your own, right? And so now we get to the 5 steps. Okay, so you're busy people. Step number 1 is you got to be relevant. You got to be relevant to yourself. You got to be clear with yourself about why what you're working on is relevant. And you got to be clear why it would be relevant to somebody else, the people that you might need, whose help you might need. So step number one is get really clear on relevance. Step 2 is to have a really clear declaration of what it is you're trying to do and why it matters. So I'm working on this so that we can get this outcome, whatever it is. And the advice I've started to give in the last several years is your declaration really shouldn't be any longer than the length of an old school tweet. It should be about 140 characters. And if it's longer than that, keep working on it until you get it shorter, because you don't want to make people work really hard to figure out what you're trying to do and why it matters. So, crafting that declaration, I think, is really key. And then step 3 is that you have to make a clear request. And so, for instance, I'm working on this so that we can accomplish this other thing. I know you've done something like this in the past. I've heard that you had amazing success with it. Could I spend an hour with you just picking your brain and getting the download on that? Or you've got some resources that on your team that I would love to borrow for a week or two. Would that be possible? Just like a clear, specific request that relates to the declaration that is clearly relevant about, what it is you're doing. And then step 4 is if you're going to make a request, you have to be prepared to have the curiosity and the intent to make offers to the other person. So I've made a request of you. What are you working on? And tell me what your main goals are right now, and really sincerely listen to the answer, and then be prepared and be looking for an opportunity to make an offer that might be of help to that person. So now we've established some reciprocity, perhaps, right? You're asking them for help, but you're also offering help, and maybe they're accepting it. And so that if that goes well, then that leads to the 5th thing, which is trust. And so I don't have to have coffee with you every month to trust you, however nice it might be. But if we had a good experience working together on this initiative or this project, and my favorite definition of trust comes from a gentleman out of Chile named Fernando Flores, and he's had many different careers, politics and others, but the one that I know him from is linguistics. He's a linguist, and he says there are basically 3 components to trust: sincerity, credibility, and competence. So if I demonstrated I was sincere, I acted with good intent, I was credible, I did what I said I was going to do when I did it, and I was competent, I did a great job with what I said I was going to do and delivered it when I said I was going to, then that builds trust. And if we both have that experience with each other, then we don't talk to each other for a year or two maybe. And if something comes up where it would be helpful to connect with each other again and work with each other again, we're going to answer the email or take the call because we had a good trust-building experience previously.
Yeah, I think it's a really good model, I think, which forces people to think of what's the value they can add to the relationship as opposed to always thinking, what can I get?
Yeah, that's so key, right? It's gimme, gimme, gimme. What's in it for me? Well, okay, what's in it for you? Yeah.
So as we come close to the end, I'd like to just also explore this idea of where you talk about in Chapter 10, pick up a big footprint view of your role and let go of a small footprint view of your role.
Yeah, yeah. One of the people I interviewed for the original edition of the book was a retired Army general named Steve Rippey. And Steve told me that in the Army, there's a well-known maxim that goes, the further up the flagpole you go, the more your ass shows. And I think that's kind of the essence of this idea of a big footprint. When you're a leader, you're always on stage. When you're a designated leader, whether you recognize it or not, or care about it or not, you need to recognize it, and you should care about it because people are always watching you and they're taking their cues from you. And I found this out through my own experience and being a corporate executive myself, through different experiences I had and conversations I had, where I remember one, I was leading HR in my last company, and I love books. I've, probably obvious, I've referenced a lot of books in this conversation, but there was a book I loved back then, and I still love. It's a great book called Slowing Down to the Speed of Life. And I bought that book by the box for a while and would just hand it out to people. And I said to my HR group, I'd give everybody a copy of it. I said, well, if you guys like this, I'll host a little book club for 5 or 6 weeks, and we'll meet on Tuesday mornings at 8 and kick off our day by talking about the book and thinking about how we can apply some of this stuff in our own lives and our work. So we had a nice little group, 10 or 15 people in the book club. And one of those people was an administrative assistant who worked around the corner from me named Lisa. And so I had known Lisa, an acquaintance really for 2 or 3 years at that point, but didn't really know her, but I got to know her better in the book club. And about 3 or 4 weeks into it, she sent me an email one day. Said, Scott, just wanted to let you know how much I'm enjoying the book and the discussion group. But the best part of this for me has been getting to know you better and learning that not all vice presidents have green blood and horns. And I just was like stunned by that, like green blood and horns. How could she think that about me? Like I had green blood and horns. But then my second thought was, wait a second, it wasn't it was not about Scott has green blood and horns. It was not all vice presidents. And that was like a huge aha for me because it was like, oh, wow, she's got this story about people at the vice president level and above, and they're all monsters or ogres. That's her story about us. And so quite often, you get this title, which is kind of cool, and your spouse and your parents are maybe impressed by that for a while. But it's like, I think you start out at a deficit almost sometimes with the organization as a whole, because they've got stories about people like you, and they're usually not positive. And in the absence of real information, people make stuff up, or maybe they actually have real information and it really was a crappy experience with all these vice presidents. And so you've got to work that. I mean, it's like I was talking about earlier, thinking, feeling, action, results. They're taking cues from you that lead to their thoughts and the way they feel about you and the organization, and that's going to have an impact on the actions they take and ultimately the results you get. So you've totally got to manage that dynamic and really be super aware of how you're coming across.
Yeah, which very much fits into this idea that you talk about minding your message.
Yeah. I actually took this out of the third edition because things didn't end well for him. But there's a guy in the States who's passed away a couple of years ago named Roger Ailes. And Roger Ailes first became known as like the media manager for the Nixon campaign, the reelect for Richard Nixon. And then he went on to found Fox News, which is a whole other conversation. But Roger Ailes had a book actually that I think he wrote before Fox News called You Are the Message, which I thought was a great title for a book. You are the message, meaning it's like Marshall McLuhan, I think, great thinker, said the medium is the message, well, you're the medium, you're the vessel as a leader of a lot of agendas, and the overall agenda. And, to rip off the title from the Ailes book, You Are the Message, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. And it's not just what you're saying, it's what you're not saying. And that could either be intentional or unintentional about what you're not saying. And there's just a lot to think about. And you really, if you're a senior leader, you really don't have any time off, in terms of message management, because even especially in the age of social media, as we've seen again and again and again with, videos that go viral and so forth, one bad day can cause a lot of damage, these days. I mean, it can go viral so quickly. So you really got to think about, what am I trying to do and how do I need to show up here all the time? I think scary, really. None of us are perfect, but I think you got to be in those questions.
Yeah, it's a constant, isn't it? Often over here, the people talk about this idea of leading by example and just always recognizing that, as you said, they're on stage.
Yeah.
So the final thing I'd just like to get your perspective on is you suggest that everyone should create an executive success plan. Why should they do that?
To get better. That's the simple answer, because we can always all be better, I think. And what was good enough last year or last month is probably not going to be good enough next month or next year. I don't mean to be like reductionist about it or pessimistic about it, but the world is always changing and things are always moving forward, and we've got to continue to grow along with the rest of the world, right? So the executive success plan, I mentioned Marshall Goldsmith very early in the conversation. It was inspired by Marshall Goldsmith's feed forward process. And I encourage my clients to pick one, no more than two things that they could work on. The more specific, the better. The more behavioral, really, the better. that could make them more effective leaders. And we have a 360 that goes with the next level that we use in different programs. And we have a self-assessment that's sort of a 1/3 version of the 360. 72 behaviors in the 360, 27, I think, or whatever the math is. I'm trying to remember the math, but I think it's around 27 behaviors in the self-assessment. It's definitely 27. It's 3 behaviors for each of the 9 pick up and let go distinctions. Those are pretty specific behaviors that leaders need to take a look at when they're moving into next level situations. So pick 1 or 2 of those, or pick another one that's not on the list that you think would make a difference, and identify a small number, no less than 5, probably no more than 10. Small number of colleagues who should have regular line of sight into how you're showing up day in and day out, like they get to work with you enough to have data points for you, and tell them what you're working on, and then ask them this question: what's your best piece of advice for anybody who's working on what I'm working on, like being a better listener? Okay, my best piece of advice for anybody who's working on being a better listener is don't interrupt so much. Okay, great. Write that down. Right. And if you ask 10 people for 2 ideas on your thing, you're going to end up with a list of 20 ideas. There'll probably be some ideas that are on that list more than once. Those are probably clues for you that that's the thing that you should actually work on, like not interrupting so much. And then you go back to your colleague and say, after talking with all of you, I've concluded that what I really need to work on is not interrupting so much. Would you be my partner in that? Like, if you see me doing it, would you give me like a sign in the meeting that I'm doing it again so I can stop? And I eventually will modify my behavior, because you're doing a couple of things by doing that. One is you're actually changing your behavior, but 2, by continuing to engage with your colleagues as you're working on getting better, you're changing their perception of your behavior. You're changing their story about you. Scott is a guy who's interrupted me for the last 10 years. I hate him because he's always interrupting me. Oh, now he's trying to work on it, and I can see him working on it. And I'm actually telling him from time to time that, hey, you're getting better. You're not interrupting me so much. So now my story about Scott has changed, right? Because we all work in systems, systems of people. And behavior change, you probably see this in your work. I think behavior change usually lags perception change. I could actually be better at not interrupting in probably 30 to 60 days if I was really working at it. But if I've been doing it for 3 years, people's perception of my behavior is not going to change in 30 to 60 days unless I help them see the change. And so that's what the executive success plan is.
Fantastic. I think I'm going to recommend everyone jump on and start to look at that. So, Scott,
I hope you do.
Know more about you and the work that you do, where should they go?
So there's 2 thoughts on that. If you want to learn more specifically about the 3rd edition of the Next Level that we've had a very thorough conversation about, thank you for that. You can go to thenextlevel.info. So thenextlevel.info for information on the 3rd edition of the book. And if you want to learn more about me and what I do in general, go to Eblin Group, like my last name, E as in E, B as in boy, LIN as in Nancy, and the word group, group.com, eblingroup.com.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for being a part of the podcast. I'm going to do a shameless plug on your behalf that I think everyone should buy the book. I think it's a great read. And I just want to say thanks again for being part of the podcast.
My pleasure, and I really appreciate all your questions. Like, I don't think I've ever had anybody go so in depth on everything in the book. So you win the award for that, Julian. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Well, that wraps up another episode of the Synergen Leadership Podcast. I trust you found it interesting. A couple of things. If you could go online and leave a review of the podcast, that would be great. Really help us in spreading awareness of the podcast. Happy for you to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. And if you want to shoot me through an email, julian@synergengroup.com.au. See you next time.